as if acts of courage and thoughtfulness. In fact, it was almost insane. There was a point in the end of the missile crisis, it was reaching a peak, when Khrushchev wrote to Kennedy and offered to settle it by a public announcement of withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and Turkish missile and U.S. missiles from Turkey. Actually, Kennedy hadn't even known they were there, and they were being withdrawn anyway because they were being replaced by more lethal Polaris submarines, which are invulnerable. So that was the offer. Kennedy and his advisors considered it and rejected it. Kennedy himself was estimating the likelihood of nuclear war at maybe a third to a half. They rejected it. They would not. He did agree to make a secret agreement that they would withdraw the missiles that they were already withdrawing, but not public. Khrushchev had to be humiliated. Kennedy had to maintain his macho image. He's praised for this. And in fact, not even mentioned, I try to find it, is that a couple of months before the crisis blew up, the United States had just sent nuclear missiles with nuclear warheads, the same kind, to Okinawa, aiming at China at a period of great regional tension. Well, who cares? We have a right to do anything we want anywhere in the world. Okay, over. The fact that there's other lessons too. No time to go into it. But 10 years after that, 1973, Henry Kissinger called a nuclear alert, the high-level nuclear alert. The point was to warn the Russians not to interfere in the Israel-Arab war that was going on, and in particular, not to interfere with the fact that Kissinger had informed the Israelis that they could violate the ceasefire that the U.S. and Russia had just agreed upon. So he wanted to make sure the Russians didn't disrupt this, so he called a nuclear alert. Well, nothing happened. 10 years after that, Ronald Reagan was in office. As soon as he came into office, he and his advisors had the U.S. Air Force penetrating Russian airspace to try to elicit information about Russian warning systems. So there could be a mock attack, Unfortunately, the Russians, they had a war scare, in fact. They might have thought this is a real first strike, but fortunately they didn't. And it goes on like that. Well, right at the moment, it's on the front pages. In the case of North Korea, case of Iran. And there are ways to deal with these crises. Maybe they won't work, but at least you can try. Not even being considered, not even being reported. If there's time, I could talk about them. So, for example, the case of Iran, which is considered in the West the gravest threat to world peace, not elsewhere, just in the West. It's a Western obsession, but not in the Arab world, not in Asia, But is there a way to deal with it? Well, a pretty sensible way. It was just proposed a couple of months ago at the meeting of the non-aligned countries, most of the world. In fact, they were just reiterating a proposal that's been around for decades, and in fact has been approved by the General Assembly and so on. The proposal is to move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Well, not the answer to everything, but a pretty significant step forward. And there are ways to proceed with that. Under UN auspices, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was to be an international conference in Finland last December, which was to try to implement plans to move towards this. Well, what happened? You won't read it in the newspapers because it wasn't reported, but what happened, you can read it in arms control journals and so on. In early November, Iran agreed to attend the meeting. A couple of days later, the U.S. canceled the meeting, saying the time wasn't right. The European Parliament issued a statement calling for it to continue. The Arab states said they would continue, but nothing. So we'll move on towards harsher sanctions against the population doesn't hurt the regime, and maybe war. Who knows what will happen. Northeast Asia is kind of the same sort of thing. North Korea may be the craziest country in the world. It's certainly a good competitor, but it does make sense to try to figure out what's in the minds of people if they're acting crazy. So why would they behave the way they're behaving? Well, just imagine ourselves in their position. Let's take, say, Spain. So suppose that Spain had been totally leveled, everything destroyed by a huge superpower, which was gloating in it. They could read the military journals, public journals of this superpower while when they'd gotten to the time when they destroyed everything in Spain, there was nothing left. They sent the Air Force to destroy the dams. Let's imagine there are huge dams that, control the water supply. So they destroyed the dams, which is, of course, a war crime for which people were hanged at Nuremberg. But destroy the dams, and then talking just very excitedly about how wonderful it was to see the water pouring down and digging out the valleys, and the Asians scurrying around trying to survive. We can't even imagine what this means to Asians. It means destruction of their rice crop, starvation and death. So it's really magnificent. It's not in our memory, but it's in their memory. And let's go to the present. And there's an interesting recent history. In 1993, Israel and North Korea were moving towards an agreement in which North Korea would stop sending any missiles or any high technology to the Middle East, and Israel would recognize North Korea. Clinton intervened and blocked it. Shortly after that, in retaliation, North Korea carried out a minor missile test. The U.S. and North Korea did reach an agreement, framework agreement, 1994, and it was more or less honored by both sides, not completely, but pretty much. When George Bush came into office, North Korea had maybe one nuclear weapon and verifiably wasn't producing any more. Maybe it didn't even have any. Well, Bush immediately launched his aggressive militarism, threatening North Korea, acts of evil and so on. So they got back to work on their nuclear program. By the time Bush left, they had 8 to 10 nuclear weapons and a missile system. In between, other things happened. In 2005, the U.S. and North Korea did reach an agreement. It was an agreement in which North Korea agreed to put an end to all nuclear weapons and missile development. In return, the U.S. and the West, but mainly the U.S., would provide a light water reactor for their medical needs and end aggressive statements. They'd form a non-aggression pact and move towards some kind of accommodation. Well, it's pretty promising, except almost immediately Bush undermined it. He withdrew the offer of the light water reactor and initiated programs to compel banks to stop dealing with any North Korean transactions, even perfectly legal ones. So North Koreans reacted by picking up their missile and weapons program. And that's pretty much the way it's been going. And it's well known to scholarship. So you can read it in straight mainstream American scholarship. What they say is, look, it's a pretty crazy regime, but they're following a kind of a tit-for-tat policy. You do something, make a hostile gesture, we'll respond with some crazy gesture. Well, what's happening right now? There are South Korean U.S. Military exercises, which, from North Korea's point of view, got to look threatening. We'd think they were threatening if they're going on in Canada, let's say. And in the course of these, the most advanced bombers in the world in history, stealth